Joining us to talk about that from Oakland University is one of their professors of political science, David Dulio, with us once again on the Oakland County MegaCast. Professor Dulio, thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So how are you? How have you been?
Dandy, just trying to get by with all the restrictions and sort of new normal, hopefully temporary normal, but doing just fine. Thanks for asking.
Always good to hear. So we're in the primary season now. We're coming up on the state primaries, and it's only a small jump in time from the primary elections to the big general election in November. With COVID-19 still looming over us, protests of police brutality and for equality of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, among other issues, has this created an even greater hotbed in the state of Michigan and on the national level for polarization of our politics?
Well, I think certainly the foundation of polarization was there pre-COVID, pre-Trump administration. I think that the president is blamed very often for creating this polarized environment, and that's just not the case. We've seen polarization on the uptick for years and years. I might even put it all the way back, really at a sort of a key point in time would have been the mid-'90s when you had Republicans in control of Congress, Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich going up against President Clinton. That seemed to really start some polarization. And if we look at just one example, President Trump's approval ratings among Democrats and versus Republicans are often cited as evidence that he's polarized the country. And without question, Republicans are much greater in terms of their approval of the president than Democrats are. But the same was true for President Obama and President George W. Bush, his predecessors, right? So that polarization was always there. COVID-19, protests, the things that are happening now are really just a new manifestation of that.
David Dulio with us from Oakland University. He's their one of their political science professors there. So what does this mean in the context of our primaries, where it's all straight party voting in Michigan? How does this polarization going to affect that? I mean, people are going to vote for their party, but are some people maybe going to look at the opposing party? If they're a Republican, maybe look at the Democratic Party. If they're a Democrat, maybe look at the Republican Party and say, well, they have these 2, 3, 4 candidates on this particular position and for these particular positions, and maybe I would be better off with one of them in the case that my candidate loses. Do you think that this polarization is going to cause people to jump political parties for strategic reasons, maybe in these straight party voting primaries in the state of Michigan?
Sure. I think that there's always a question about that when we're talking about a primary where not in Michigan, but in other states, it's reserved only for those partisans, those who identify with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party that are making those choices for their party, right? But in Michigan, we have this open primary system where anybody can participate in either of the primaries. And we often hear about it during a presidential primary, like the one we had in the spring, where there were questions, are Republicans going to go over and vote in the Democratic presidential primary? In 2016, the question was, are these Democrats going to go and vote in the Republican presidential primary? And does some of that happen? Sure, right? Of course. We see some Democrats go vote in the Republican primary and vice versa to try and fiddle with the, not necessarily the outcome, but give certain candidates more votes than others. Does it impact the outcome? I highly doubt it. The changes we see there or the impact we see there are marginal at best. And I think in a polarized time, I think, looking forward to the August primary, we're going to have, I think, more partisans stay home rather than cross over.
How important will the independent voter be in this upcoming election?
Sorry, Ronnie, in the primary or the general?
Either one or both.
Well, in the primary, not very. The primary electorate really is from the fringes of the political spectrum. The primary voters on the Democratic side are those folks that are hardcore Democrats, that they are strong partisans, and the same thing on the Republican side. And we know this because, we have exit poll data from time to time, but, the turnout numbers also tell us that a lot of independents, a lot of those sort of middle of the road voters who might come and go from politics don't participate certainly as much as those who are on the edges of the spectrum. Now, in the general, they play a much bigger role because they enter politics, they enter the electorate for the general election where they may not have done so during the primary. And all of a sudden, you've got a much bigger pool of voters that candidates are going after. And depending on what race they're running, depending on what office they're seeking, depending on what district they might be running in, they have to have different strategies for winning. And sometimes in some areas, a base-only strategy works just fine, where if you can get all the voters from your party, you can win. But in other areas, you need to get your base and attract some of those independent or more moderate voters who are just coming into the electorate, having sat out the primary. So it really depends on where you're running, what you're running for, and the context of that campaign.
How important is the state of Michigan going to be for the general election?
For president, it's critical, right? Michigan is going to be at the top of the list in terms of states that are coveted by the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign. It's been that way since, well, frankly, November of 2016. We're looking ahead to 2020. Everybody's had Michigan on their list, and it's because President Trump flipped Michigan in 2016 after the state had voted several election cycles in a row for Democratic candidates. So the president sees it as absolutely critical to his reelection chances, and Democrats see it as a prime opportunity to flip it back to be part of the so-called blue wall that was being built for Hillary Clinton that frankly fell apart in 2016. But Democrats are going to try to rebuild that and make it. And without Michigan, the president's path to reelection becomes a lot more difficult. And you can see this already happening. If you've watched television, like many of us have been sort of forced to with lockdowns and closures and all that sort of thing, you're already seeing advertisements from the Biden campaign, from the president's campaign, from outside interest groups that are looking to impact that race. And June, July is really early, relatively speaking, for campaigns at a presidential level to start engaging in a state. So it just tells you just how important and how much focus is going to be on our state.
David Dulio joining us. He's a political science professor at Oakland University. So we talked about how the polarization could impact the primaries, could impact the general elections as well. And just to go back on that, in the context of pre-pandemic, current pandemic, and post-pandemic, we were polarized before. It's maybe increased with the frustrations that we've seen amount during the pandemic. Are we at a point now in terms of the polarization of our political landscape where we've dug too far of a hole and there's no way out? Or is there still some hope there that there is a way out of this polarized landscape to something that's more neutral or conversational?
I sure hope so. And I think that, I wouldn't write it off just yet because, frankly, if that's the case, we're in real trouble. If we get to a point where there's no hope of people being able to calmly come together and have a discussion about differences of opinion and being able to rationally and calmly discuss different policy options that are in front of them, and I don't know where we go from there. And that's one of the things that is really what we focus on at Oakland University in our Center for Civic Engagement. We bill ourselves as a convener of conversations about issues of public importance, where we want to be the place where folks can come together and have discussions, have conversations about important issues, but to do it in the quote unquote right way, right? Where there's civil, respectful, and deliberative dialogues.
In terms of wearing masks, even safety precautions have become a bit of a political issue with both parties. You wear the mask, you're either saving on one side you wear the mask, you're saving the world, or you're destroying freedom. On the other side, if you don't wear the mask, you're killing all of us, or you're taking a stand for your rights. why have even these public health issues been so politicized lately? And are we at a point now where even issues that are not necessarily politically centered are having the polarization bleed into those discussions as well?
Right. And I think that, your phrase there about politically centered, I think is key, because in the past, these kinds of things may not have been politically focused. But given the fact that there are some polarizing individuals that are part of these that are part of these part of the context, right, around COVID-19, around decisions being made around COVID-19, whether that's President Trump or Governor Whitmer or politicians and elected officials in other areas, they get dragged. These questions of public health get dragged into the political sphere, and I think that face coverings are just another manifestation of how polarization is impacting us. And frankly, we really shouldn't be surprised that this is the case. And I say that for one reason. In a polarized time, and we can hear certain descriptions of it as, politics is tribal these days, or people think of it in terms of their team versus the other team. Face masks might just be the New Jersey that, not New Jersey, the state, the New Jersey of politics, right? Where if you're on one team, you're wearing a mask. If you're on another team, you're not wearing a mask, right? And it's a way to show your allegiance. It's a way to show your team pride. And I think that it's just, again, another manifestation of how that's going to play out.
David Dulio with us on the Oakland County Megacast. Another minute or so with you. Anything else you'd like to touch on or that we haven't talked about just yet that would be important to discuss before we let you go?
Well, I think that your listeners and viewers need to get ready for a wild ride in terms of elections in the next several months. We've got from July 4th to Election Day. May not seem like a long time, but it is in politics. It's a lifetime in politics in many regards, and a lot can happen. And I think a lot will happen. There is so much uncertainty out there with regard to COVID-19, with regard to the economic impact and that we're going to see from COVID-19, whether or not we have to go through another series of closures or a lockdown, and how long that might last. All of that will impact not just the presidential race, but campaigns up and down the ballot that we're going to have to see and really keep an eye on how the public health context and the political context around that is going to impact those races.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Professor.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thank you very much for being with us. David Dulio, Professor of Political Science at Oakland University, with us on the Oakland County Megacast.